What happens when the most powerful man in the room needs to pretend to be vulnerable? When a CEO who's built his entire empire on control suddenly finds himself asking a complete stranger to save him from his own success? Picture this. You're at an elegant wedding feeling completely out of place, when suddenly the most intimidating business mogul in the country walks up to you and whispers 4 words that will change everything. Pretend you're with me. This isn't just another love story. This is about what happens when 2 people who've mastered the art of professional facades discover that the most dangerous game isn't played in boardrooms or newsrooms, it's played with human hearts. Alexander Stone had everything figured out. At 32, he was the youngest CEO to ever run a billion-dollar empire, respected by competitors, feared by rivals. But there was one thing his money and power couldn't protect him from: his own family's matchmaking schemes and the relentless media attention that came with his success. Sophia Reynolds was equally formidable in her own world. As an investigative financial journalist, she'd built her career on exposing the truth behind corporate lies and bringing down powerful men who thought they were untouchable. She trusted facts, evidence, and her instincts, never her heart. So when these 2 masters of control entered into what should have been a simple arrangement, a fake relationship to solve both their problems, neither expected the one thing they couldn't control: falling for each other for real. But here's the twist that makes this story unforgettable. Sometimes the person you're pretending to love might be the same person you're trying to destroy, and sometimes the choice between professional success and personal happiness isn't a choice at all. It's a test of who you really are when everything you've worked for is on the line. This is the story of 2 people who thought they knew exactly who they were, until they met each other and discovered that the most authentic version of themselves only existed when they were together. It's about the fine line between performance and reality, between protection and vulnerability, between the person you show the world and the person you are when no one's watching. Picture yourself in a place where you definitely shouldn't be alone. That's exactly how Sophia Reynolds felt at that moment. The ballroom was filled with elegant people, laughter echoed through the air, and she was there, holding a champagne flute she'd barely touched, watching couples dance as if the world were perfect. Sophia was a respected financial journalist, someone who knew how to navigate the turbulent waters of the business world with surgical precision. But weddings? Weddings were uncharted territory, especially when you arrive alone and every glance seems to whisper the same question. Why did she come without a date? She tried to blend in, chatted with some acquaintances, smiled politely at strangers, but the feeling of displacement only grew. It was as if she had an invisible sign on her forehead saying, "Available for others' pity." And the worst part? The couple's aunts started circulating, with that look every single woman knows all too well, and the look of someone mentally calculating how many eligible bachelors are present. That's when he appeared. Alexander Stone wasn't the type of man who went unnoticed. Tall dark hair perfectly styled, a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But it wasn't just his impeccable appearance that drew attention. It was the aura. That presence that made people fall silent when he passed, as if the very air changed density. Sophia recognized him immediately. Who worked in the financial world and didn't know Alexander Stone, the youngest and most ruthless CEO in the market, known for transforming ruined companies into billion-dollar empires. Also known for his legendary coldness and for never ever appearing at social events with a companion. So why the hell was he walking directly toward her? Sophia felt her heart race as he approached. Not the "what an interesting man" type, but the "what does this corporate shark want with me" type. She knew the stories. Alexander Stone didn't do anything without purpose and certainly didn't initiate random conversations at weddings. He stopped right in front of her, and Sophia noticed he seemed uncomfortable. That was strange. The man who faced hostile board meetings with the calm of a lake on a windless day was clearly avoiding something. "Sorry to bother you," he said, and his voice was even more impressive in person. Deep, controlled, each word pronounced with surgical precision. "Would you mind if I sat here?" Sophia blinked a few times. Alexander Stone was asking to sit at the practically empty table where she'd taken refuge. "Sure, feel free," she replied, trying to sound casual while internally analyzing all possibilities. He sat with the elegance of someone trained since childhood to occupy spaces with authority. For a few seconds they remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Sophia was about to break the silence with some polite comment about the wedding when he leaned slightly toward her. "Pretend you're with me," he whispered, so low she almost doubted she'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" Sophia turned to face him directly. "Pretend you're with me," he repeated, his eyes fixed on some point in the ballroom. "Please." Sophia followed his gaze and understood immediately. An older woman, elegantly dressed with a predatory smile, was heading toward them, accompanied by a young blonde who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Family trouble?" Sophia asked, surprising herself with her own audacity. "You could say that," Alexander murmured, and for the first time Sophia detected something almost human in his voice, a hint of exhaustion.
"My aunt has an unhealthy obsession with my personal life. The situation was absurd."
There she was, Sophia Reynolds, being requested to participate in a charade by none other than Alexander Stone. The pragmatic woman in her said to get up and leave. The curious journalist said to stay and find out what was happening. And a third voice, one she preferred to ignore, said there was something intriguing about this request for help. "And what exactly do I gain by pretending to be your companion?" she asked, deciding that if she was going to enter this game, she'd at least establish the rules. For the first time, Alexander smiled. It wasn't a full smile, just a subtle curve at the corner of his mouth, but it was enough for Sophia to realize he was even more dangerous when he wasn't being intimidating. You avoid being bombarded with questions about why an intelligent woman like you came alone to a wedding. Touché. He'd noticed her discomfort. His aunt was approaching rapidly, and Sophia made a decision that would change everything. She leaned closer to him, allowing her perfume to mix with his, and whispered, "Then we'd better make this convincing." What happened next was pure chemistry. Alexander placed his hand over hers on the table, a simple gesture that sent an electric current up Sophia's arm. They looked directly into each other's eyes for the first time that evening, and she saw something that business magazines never captured. Alexander Stone had intense eyes, but there was depth there, layers that suggested much more than the cold persona he showed the world. "Alexander, darling," the aunt's shrill voice cut through the moment. "I thought you said you were coming alone." "Change of plans, Aunt Victoria," Alexander replied without taking his eyes off Sophia. "Sophia, this is my Aunt Victoria and my cousin Jessica." Sophia extended her hand with the confidence of someone who closes million-dollar deals daily. "Pleasure to meet you both." What followed was an Oscar-worthy performance. Alexander was attentive without being excessive. Sophia was charming without seeming forced. And together they created the perfect illusion of a couple comfortable with each other. When the aunt finally walked away, satisfied to have finally met Alexander's mysterious girlfriend, Sophia and Alexander looked at each other with a mixture of relief and mutual admiration. "You're good at this," he said. And there was something different in his voice now, warmer, less guarded. "So are you," she replied, realizing she was no longer pretending when she smiled at him. The rest of the evening flowed surprisingly naturally. They danced to a slow song, and Sophia discovered Alexander was an excellent dancer. They talked about everything and nothing, carefully avoiding overly personal topics, but creating an artificial intimacy that, strangely, didn't feel artificial. But as the night progressed, Sophia couldn't stop thinking, what would happen when the music stopped? The lights came on and they returned to their real lives? Because one thing was becoming dangerously clear. This charade was starting to feel more real than she'd ever imagined possible. 3 days had passed since the wedding, and Sophia Reynolds thought she'd never see Alexander Stone again. She was wrong. The knock on her office door came at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Sophia knew because she'd been staring at her computer screen, pretending to work while actually replaying every moment of their unexpected evening together. When her assistant announced that Alexander Stone was here to see her, Sophia's heart did that annoying flutter thing she'd been trying to ignore. "Send him in," she said, straightening her blazer and wondering why she suddenly cared about her appearance. Alexander walked into her modest office like he owned the building, which, knowing his portfolio, he very well might. He looked exactly as commanding as he had at the wedding, but there was something different about him now. Less guarded, maybe, or perhaps she was just seeing him through different eyes after their shared performance. "Miss Reynolds," he said, closing the door behind him. "I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit." Not at all, Mr. Stone, though I have to admit, I'm curious about what brings you to my humble workspace. He smiled at that, the same subtle curve she remembered from the wedding. I have a proposition for you. Sophia leaned back in her chair, journalist instincts kicking in. I'm listening. Our little arrangement at the wedding worked better than I expected, Alexander began, moving to the window that overlooked the bustling city below. It seems the photos of us together have already started circulating in certain circles. My publicist tells me it's the first time in years that the media coverage about me has been positive. Positive how? Apparently having a girlfriend makes me seem more human. Less of the cold-hearted corporate machine the press loves to portray. He turned back to face her. The board members are pleased. Shareholders are responding well. Even my own family seems relieved that I'm finally settling down. Sophia felt a strange mix of flattery and suspicion. And you want to continue the charade? Temporarily, yes. Alexander sat down across from her desk, leaning forward slightly. I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. You continue to play the role of my girlfriend for social events, and in return, I'll provide you with access to exclusive financial information that could significantly advance your career. The journalist in Sophia perked up immediately. Access to Alexander Stone's world meant access to stories that could make her career. But there was something else. Something she'd been investigating for months that suddenly seemed within reach. What kind of access are we talking about? She asked carefully. Board meetings, charity galas, investor dinners, the kind of events where real business gets discussed over cocktails and handshakes. Alexander's eyes met hers, the kind of access most financial journalists would kill for. He was right, and they both knew it. But Sophia had her own agenda. For the past 6 months, she'd been following a trail of suspicious financial transactions linked to offshore accounts. The story had the potential to expose a major money laundering operation, but she'd hit dead ends at every turn. Being close to Alexander Stone could open doors she'd never imagined. How long are we talking about? She asked. A few months, maybe less, just until things settle down and the media finds someone else to focus on. Sophia studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. And what exactly would this arrangement entail? Public appearances as needed. Nothing more than what we did at the wedding. Professional, believable, but ultimately just for show. Alexander paused, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. Though I have to admit, you made it remarkably easy to forget it was just pretend. There it was again. That electric tension that had caught them both off guard at the wedding. Sophia felt her resolve wavering, but she forced herself to focus on the opportunity this presented. I'll need complete transparency about the events we'll attend and the people we'll meet, she said. And I reserve the right to end this arrangement at any time. Agreed. Alexander stood up, extending his hand. So we have a deal? Sophia shook his hand, noting how perfectly it fit with hers. We have a deal. Their first test came just 2 days later, a charity gala for children's education. Sophia spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing her dress, finally settling on a midnight blue number that was elegant without being too flashy. When Alexander picked her up, the look in his eyes told her she'd chosen well. You look stunning, he said, and the way he said it made her believe he meant it. The gala was held at the city's most exclusive hotel, and from the moment they walked in together, Sophia felt like she was in a different world. These weren't just wealthy people. These were the people who shaped economies, influenced policies, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. Alexander was in his element, moving through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged. But what surprised Sophia was how naturally she fit into this world. Years of interviewing high-profile executives had given her the skills to navigate these social waters, and Alexander's presence beside her opened doors that would normally remain firmly closed. You're a natural at this, Alexander whispered during a brief moment alone. I'm almost convinced we're actually together. That's the point, isn't it? Sophia replied, but she couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened when he leaned close to speak. The evening progressed smoothly until Sophia found herself in conversation with Margaret Harrison, the wife of a prominent investment banker. The woman was slightly drunk and more talkative than she probably should have been. Alexander's such a catch, Margaret gushed. Though I have to say, some of his business practices are a bit questionable. All those offshore accounts and shell companies. But I suppose that's just how business is done these days. Sophia's journalistic radar went into overdrive. Offshore accounts? Oh, you know, the usual. Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands. My husband handles some of the paperwork for Stone Industries' subsidiary companies. BLC Holdings, I think it's called. Margaret giggled. Don't tell Alexander I mentioned it. These men and their secrets. BLC Holdings. Sophia memorized the name, her heart racing with excitement. This was exactly the kind of lead she'd been hoping for. When Alexander returned to her side moments later, Sophia had to work hard to maintain her composure. Everything all right? He asked, noting her expression. Perfect, she said, forcing a smile. Just making new friends. As the evening wound down, Alexander walked her to her car. You were incredible tonight, he said. I don't think I've ever had such an easy time at one of these events. You weren't so bad yourself, Sophia replied, trying to ignore the way the moonlight highlighted the strong lines of his jaw. There's another event next week. A smaller gathering, but important clients will be there. Alexander stepped closer, and Sophia caught that intoxicating scent of his cologne. Same arrangement? Same arrangement, she agreed, though her voice sounded breathier than she intended. For a moment they stood there in the parking garage, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Alexander stepped back, the professional mask sliding back into place. I'll have my assistant send you the details, he said. As Sophia drove home that night, her mind was racing. She had a name, BLC Holdings, and with it potentially the biggest story of her career. But she also couldn't stop thinking about the way Alexander had looked at her, the way her skin had tingled when he'd placed his hand on her back to guide her through the crowd. She was playing a dangerous game, and she was starting to realize that the biggest risk wasn't getting caught in their deception. The biggest risk was falling for a man she was supposed to be investigating, a man whose world she was infiltrating under false pretenses. But as she pulled into her driveway, Sophia made a decision. She would pursue both, the story and whatever was developing between them. After all, she was a journalist. She was supposed to be good at juggling multiple narratives. What she didn't realize was that some stories have a way of becoming more real than the truth itself. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Sophia Reynolds discovered something unexpected about Alexander Stone. He had layers she never could have imagined. It started with a text message on a Thursday evening. Simple, direct, very much in character. Concert tomorrow night, Brahms, are you free? Sophia stared at her phone, surprised. This wasn't a business event or a charity gala. This felt personal. She typed back, I didn't know you were into classical music. His response came quickly. There's a lot you don't know about me. The challenge in those words made her pulse quicken. She found herself typing yes before she could overthink it. The concert was at the city's premier symphony hall, and when Alexander picked her up, he looked different. Still impeccably dressed, but more relaxed somehow. The rigid businessman facade had softened around the edges. This is beautiful, Sophia said as they took their seats in what were clearly premium spots. My mother used to bring me here, Alexander said quietly, and there was something vulnerable in his voice that caught Sophia off guard. She said that music was the only language that could express what words couldn't. Sophia turned to study his profile in the dim lighting. Used to? She died when I was 16. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Car accident. I'm sorry, Sophia said and meant it. She would have liked you, he said, then seemed surprised by his own words. She always said I needed someone who could challenge me intellectually. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the Stone family legacy. As the music began, Sophia found herself stealing glances at Alexander. She watched his face soften as the orchestra played, saw the way his fingers unconsciously moved with the rhythm. This wasn't the cold CEO the media portrayed. This was someone with depth, with genuine emotion barely contained beneath the surface. During intermission, they walked to the balcony overlooking the city lights. Your mother sounds like she was an amazing woman, Sophia said. Alexander leaned against the railing, his guard dropping further. She was the only person who ever saw me as just Alexander, not as the future of Stone Industries. After she died, my father made it clear that being just Alexander wasn't an option anymore. What do you mean? Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect business decisions. No room for mistakes, no room for weakness. Alexander's laugh was bitter, He used to say that emotions were a luxury we couldn't afford, that the stone name came with responsibilities that required sacrifice. Sophia felt something shift inside her chest, a dangerous combination of sympathy and attraction. That sounds incredibly lonely. It was. Alexander turned to face her, and in the soft lighting his eyes seemed almost vulnerable. Until recently. The weight of his words hung between them, and Sophia felt the careful boundaries of their arrangement beginning to blur. This wasn't part of their deal. This felt real in a way that scared her. Alexander, she started, but he stepped closer. I know this complicates things, he said softly, but being with you these past few weeks, even pretending, it's the first time in years I've felt like I could just be myself. The music resumed before Sophia could respond, but the spell had been cast. As they listened to Brahms together, she found herself hyper-aware of every breath Alexander took, every subtle shift in his posture. When his hand accidentally brushed hers on the armrest, the contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. After the concert, neither of them seemed ready for the evening to end. They walked slowly through the city streets, talking about everything except what was really happening between them. There's something I need to tell you about my father, Alexander said as they paused outside a late-night cafe. He's been pressuring me to get married. Says it's time I settled down and produced an heir. His voice carried a note of disgust. Our arrangement has bought me some breathing room, but he's starting to ask questions about when he'll get to meet you properly. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he's planning to vet you like a potential business merger. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, messing up his perfectly styled look. I won't put you through that. We can end this arrangement anytime you want. Sophia should have said yes. Should have taken the easy exit he was offering. Instead, she heard herself saying, "What if I don't want to end it?" Alexander's eyes snapped to hers, searching for something. Sophia, we have a deal, she said quickly, trying to backtrack. And I'm getting great material for my articles. But they both knew she wasn't talking about articles. 3 days later, they attended another event. This one, a private party at a rooftop restaurant. The guest list was smaller but even more exclusive, filled with the kind of people who shaped policy behind closed doors. Alexander was more relaxed than Sophia had ever seen him. His tie was loosened, his usual rigid posture had given way to something more natural, and when he laughed at her jokes, the sound was genuine and warm. You're different tonight, Sophia observed as they stood apart from the crowd. Sharing a quiet moment, so are you, he replied, and there was heat in his gaze that made her breath catch. The party was winding down when it happened. They were saying goodbye to their hosts when Alexander was pulled into a last-minute business conversation. Sophia excused herself to the restroom, and when she returned, she found Alexander in an animated discussion with 2 men she didn't recognize. The Cayman transfers should be processed by next week, one of them was saying. BLC Holdings has been our most profitable subsidiary this quarter. Sophia's blood ran cold. BLC Holdings, the same company Margaret Harrison had mentioned weeks ago. She moved closer, pretending to check her phone while straining to hear more. Just make sure everything's clean, Alexander was saying. I don't want any red flags that could attract unwanted attention. The men nodded and walked away, leaving Alexander alone. When he turned and saw Sophia approaching, his smile was warm and unguarded. Ready to go? He asked, placing his hand on the small of her back in a gesture that had become natural between them. Actually, Sophia said, her heart pounding for all the wrong reasons now. Could we take a walk first? I need some air. They found themselves on the building's observation deck, the city spread out below them like a constellation of possibilities and secrets. Alexander moved to stand behind Sophia at the railing, his presence warm and solid. This is nice, he said, his breath tickling her ear. Just us, no pretense, no audience to perform for. Sophia's chest tightened with guilt. If only he knew how much pretense there really was. Alexander, she started, turning to face him, but whatever she was going to say died on her lips when she saw the way he was looking at her. You make me forget this is just pretend, he said softly, echoing the exact words from her dreams. And then he was kissing her. The kiss was everything she hadn't expected and everything she'd secretly hoped for. Alexander's lips were warm and sure, and when his hands tangled in her hair, Sophia felt herself melting into him, despite every rational thought screaming at her to stop. This wasn't part of their arrangement. This was dangerous territory that could destroy everything: her investigation, her career, and worst of all, whatever fragile trust was building between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "This changes things," he whispered. "Yes," Sophia breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "It does." As Alexander drove her home that night, Sophia's mind was racing. The kiss had been incredible, but the conversation she'd overheard kept replaying in her head. BLC Holdings came in transfers. Keeping things clean, it all pointed to exactly the kind of financial irregularities she'd been investigating. The man who'd just kissed her like she was the most precious thing in his world might be exactly the criminal she'd been trying to expose. The invitation came on embossed paper, delivered by Alexander's personal assistant with a note that made Sophia's heart skip. "I'd like you to meet the most important person in my life." Emily Stone was nothing like Sophia had expected Alexander's sister to be. Where he was controlled and measured, Emily was vibrant and spontaneous. Where Alexander chose his words carefully, Emily spoke with the kind of honesty that comes from never having to worry about corporate espionage or hostile takeovers. "So you're the mysterious woman who's managed to crack my brother's armor," Emily said with a grin as they sat in her cozy apartment. A stark contrast to Alexander's minimalist penthouse. "I have to admit I was skeptical when he first mentioned you." "Skeptical?" Sophia asked, accepting the cup of tea Emily offered. "Alexander doesn't do relationships. Never has, really. After our mother died, he built these walls around himself that seemed impossible to break through." Emily studied Sophia with intelligent eyes that were remarkably similar to her brother's. "But something about you has changed him. He actually smiles now when he talks about you." The guilt hit Sophia like a physical blow. Here was this genuine, warm woman talking about how happy her brother seemed, and Sophia was living a lie that could destroy him. He's changed my life too," Sophia said, and realized with a start that it wasn't entirely untrue. "Good," Emily said firmly, "because Alexander deserves someone who sees past the Stone Industries empire to the person underneath. He's been carrying the weight of our family's expectations for so long. I was starting to worry he'd forgotten who he really was." They spent the afternoon talking, and with each passing hour, Sophia felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Emily shared stories about their childhood, about how Alexander used to sneak her ice cream when their father wasn't looking, about how he'd worked 3 jobs in college because he was too proud to ask their father for money after a fight about his major. He wanted to be a teacher. "You know," Emily said as they walked through her neighborhood, "history. He was passionate about it, said he wanted to help kids understand how the past shaped the present. But after Mom died, Dad made it clear that wasn't an option for a Stone." By the time Alexander picked Sophia up that evening, she felt like she'd been emotionally flayed. The man who wrapped his arm around her waist and kissed her temple wasn't the cold corporate titan the media portrayed. He was someone who'd sacrificed his dreams for family duty, someone who'd been shaped by loss and expectation into something he'd never intended to become. "How did it go?" Alexander asked as they drove through the city. "She's wonderful," Sophia said, and meant it. "You're lucky to have her." "I am." Alexander's smile was soft and genuine. "She likes you, by the way. Texted me while I was in meetings to say I'd better not screw this up." The weight of her deception pressed down on Sophia like a physical force. "Alexander, there's something I need to tell you." "Actually," he interrupted, pulling into the parking garage of his building, "there's something I want to show you first." Alexander's penthouse was exactly what she'd expected. Sleek, modern, expensive. But he led her past all of that to a room she hadn't seen before. A study lined with books from floor to ceiling. "This was my sanctuary growing up," he said, running his fingers along the spines of well-worn history texts. "The only place where I could be who I wanted to be instead of who I was supposed to be." Sophia moved closer, reading the titles. "Military history, ancient civilizations, biographies of great teachers and leaders. You still love it," she observed. "I do." Alexander turned to face her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "I've never shown this room to anyone before. Not even the women I've dated. Why are you showing me?" "Because I trust you," he said simply. Because you make me want to be honest about who I really am." The irony was like a knife to the heart. Here he was being completely authentic with her, and she was living the biggest lie of her life. "Alexander." She started again, but he stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "I know this isn't what we agreed to," he said softly. "I know this complicates everything. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is fake." When he kissed her this time, Sophia felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, something deeper. Her resolve, maybe. Her ability to separate the woman falling for this man from the journalist trying to expose him. That night, after Alexander fell asleep beside her, Sophia couldn't stop staring at the ceiling. She'd crossed every line she'd sworn she wouldn't cross. She'd slept with the man she was investigating. She'd fallen for him. And worse, she'd let him fall for her while living a lie. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. You'll want to see this." A friend? Sophia slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Alexander, and opened her laptop in the living room. The email contained a single attachment, a financial document that made her blood run cold. Transfer authorization, $50 million from Stone Industries to BLC Holdings, Cayman Islands. Purpose: operational restructuring. Authorized signature: Alexander Stone. The signature was unmistakably his. She'd seen him sign documents at enough events to recognize the sharp, confident strokes. The date was from just 2 weeks ago, right around the time of their first kiss. Sophia stared at the document until her eyes burned. This was it, the smoking gun she'd been looking for. Proof of the money laundering operation she'd been investigating for months. And Alexander's signature was right there, authorizing transfers to offshore accounts that existed for no legitimate business purpose. She sat there in the dark, laptop screen illuminating her face, trying to reconcile the man sleeping in the next room with the criminal activity documented in front of her. The Alexander who'd shared his deepest vulnerabilities with her, who'd trusted her with his childhood sanctuary, who'd looked at her like she was his salvation. Was he the same man who'd been systematically moving millions of dollars through shell companies? The rational part of her brain said yes. The evidence was right there. The timing aligned with everything she'd uncovered. Alexander Stone was exactly the kind of sophisticated criminal who could compartmentalize his personal and professional lives so completely that even someone as close as she'd become might never see the truth. But her heart kept whispering a different story. The man who'd held her while she slept, who'd shared stories about his mother, who'd trusted her with parts of himself he'd never shown anyone else. That man couldn't be a criminal. Could he? As dawn broke over the city, Sophia made a decision that would change everything. She copied the document to her secure drive and closed the laptop. She would confront Alexander directly. She would give him a chance to explain, to prove that there was some other explanation for what she'd found. But as she looked back toward the bedroom where he lay sleeping, she couldn't shake the feeling that by morning, everything between them would be irreparably broken. Because even if Alexander wasn't guilty of the crimes she suspected, the truth about who she really was and why she'd gotten close to him would destroy any chance they might have had. Either way, the game was about to end, and Sophia was beginning to realize that the person who would be hurt most by its conclusion might just be herself. 3 days had passed since Alexander stormed out of Sophia's apartment, and the silence between them felt like a living thing, growing more suffocating with each passing hour. The confrontation had been brutal. Sophia had planned to ease into the conversation, to give Alexander a chance to explain the financial documents she'd found. Instead, he'd arrived at her door that morning with fury in his eyes and accusations on his lips. "Financial journalist," he'd said, the words dripping with contempt. "How long have you been planning this? Was any of it real, or was I just another story to you?" Sophia had tried to explain, tried to tell him about her feelings, about how she'd fallen for him despite her original intentions. But Alexander's pride had been wounded too deeply. He'd looked at her like she was a stranger, worse, like she was an enemy. "It's over, Sophia. I don't want to see you again." Now, alone in her apartment with evidence of financial crime scattered across her desk, Sophia felt hollowed out. She'd won. She had the story that would make her career, but the victory tasted like ash in her mouth. Her phone rang, jolting her from her brooding. "Unknown number, Miss Reynolds." The voice was unfamiliar, professional. "This is Detective Morrison with the Financial Crimes Unit. We need to discuss Alexander Stone." Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs. "What about him?" "We have reason to believe you've been investigating the same money laundering operation we've been tracking. We'd like to meet." 2 hours later, Sophia sat across from Detective Morrison in a downtown cafe, her world tilting on its axis as he explained what the police had discovered. Richard Hayes, Stone Industries Vice President of Operations, has been using the company's offshore subsidiaries to launder money for several criminal organizations, Morrison said, sliding a thick file across the table. "We believe he's been forging Alexander Stone's signature on authorization documents for months." Sophia's hands shook as she opened the file. Inside were dozens of financial records, expert analysis of signature comparisons, and a timeline that painted a picture she'd never imagined. "Alexander isn't involved," she whispered. "Not only is he not involved, he's been trying to investigate the irregularities himself. We have records of him hiring a private forensic accountant 3 months ago." Morrison leaned forward. "Miss Reynolds, we think Richard Hayes knows that Stone is closing in on him. We have reason to believe Stone could be in danger." The blood drained from Sophia's face. "What kind of danger?" "The kind where loose ends get tied up permanently." Sophia was already reaching for her phone when Morrison's hand stopped her. "We've been trying to reach Stone for 2 days. His phone goes straight to voicemail, his assistant says he's taking personal time, and he's not at any of his usual locations." "Emily," Sophia breathed. "His sister would know where he is." But when they called Emily, her voice was tight with worry. "I haven't heard from Alex in 3 days. That's not like him. He always calls, especially after—" Emily paused. "After whatever happened between you two. He was devastated, Sophia. I've never seen him like that." Detective Morrison exchanged a look with his partner. "Miss Reynolds, we need your help." "If Stone trusts you—" "He doesn't trust me anymore," Sophia interrupted. "I destroyed that." "Then you'd better hope we find him before Hayes does." The next few hours passed in a blur of police stations and frantic phone calls. They tracked Alexander's credit card to a hotel downtown, but when they arrived, the room was empty. The only clue was a note from hotel management saying he'd received a call and left abruptly. It was Emily who figured it out. "The warehouse district," she said when they called her back. "Alex owns a property there, an old building he was going to renovate into a community center. If he's hiding somewhere, thinking through everything that happened, that's where he'd go." But when they arrived at the address Emily had given them, Sophia's blood turned to ice. Alexander's car was there, but so were 2 black SUVs she didn't recognize. "This isn't right," Detective Morrison muttered, speaking into his radio to call for backup. They were too late. By the time they breached the warehouse, they found Alexander tied to a chair in the center of the empty space, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Richard Hayes stood over him, a gun in his hand. "You couldn't just leave it alone, could you?" Hayes was saying. "All those questions about the offshore accounts, hiring that forensic accountant. You were going to ruin everything." Alexander's voice was steady despite his situation. "The FBI already knows, Richard. Killing me won't change that. Maybe not, but it'll buy me time to disappear." Hayes raised the gun. "Sorry it has to end this way, Alex. Nothing personal. Drop the weapon." Morrison's voice echoed through the warehouse as police flooded in from multiple entrances. What happened next felt like it lasted hours but probably took only seconds. Hayes spun toward the police, gun swinging wildly. Alexander, still tied to the chair, threw his weight sideways, trying to get out of the line of fire. Hayes fired twice, once toward the police, once in Alexander's direction. Sophia didn't remember moving. One moment she was behind a concrete pillar with Detective Morrison. The next she was rushing toward Alexander as Hayes was tackled by 3 officers. She dropped to her knees beside the overturned chair, her hands shaking as she worked to untie the ropes. "Sophia?" Alexander's voice was hoarse with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "You're bleeding," she said instead of answering, pressing her scarf against a graze on his arm where Hayes's bullet had caught him. "I'm fine." "But you shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "The danger's over," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "Richard Hayes was the one behind the money laundering. He was forging your signature, Alexander. You were never involved." Alexander stared at her for a long moment. "You thought I was a criminal." "I found evidence that suggested—" Sophia started, then stopped. "Yes, I thought you might be involved. And I hated myself for it because I'd fallen in love with you and I couldn't figure out how to reconcile what I felt with what I thought I knew. And now, Detective Morrison approached them, his presence a reminder that they weren't alone. "Mr. Stone, we'll need you to come in for a statement. But the paramedics want to check you over first." As the EMTs fussed over Alexander's injuries, minor, thankfully, Sophia found herself standing apart from the chaos, watching the man she'd thought she'd lost forever. When he was finally cleared by the medical team, he walked over to where she waited. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "The police saved your life. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." Alexander studied her face in the harsh warehouse lighting. "Even after everything? Even after I said those things to you? Even after everything?" Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know I betrayed your trust. But Alexander, what I felt for you was never fake. What I feel for you is the most real thing in my life." For a moment, they stood there in the wreckage of the warehouse, surrounded by police and evidence of crimes neither of them had committed, and Sophia held her breath. "I believe you," Alexander said finally. "Please don't leave me." When he pulled her into his arms, Sophia felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't even realized was broken. This wasn't the end of their story. It was finally the beginning of the real one. 6 months later, Alexander Stone stood at the podium of the city's largest press conference room, looking out at a sea of reporters and camera crews. The media frenzy around the Richard Hayes scandal had finally begun to die down, but today's announcement would put the final period on that chapter of his life. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in the industry. "I'm here today to address the recent events surrounding Stone Industries and to introduce someone very important to me." Sophia Reynolds sat in the front row, her heart pounding as she watched the man she loved command the room with the same confidence he'd always possessed, but with something new, a warmth that hadn't been there before their journey together. "Over the past few months, you've heard a lot about financial irregularities within our company. I want to be clear that these activities were carried out without my knowledge by Richard Hayes, our former vice president of operations, who is now facing federal charges." Alexander's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of reporters who had once painted him as a cold, calculating machine. "But that's not why I'm here today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alexander Stone calling press conferences for personal matters was unprecedented. "I'm here to thank someone who risked everything to ensure the truth came to light. Someone who put her career, her safety, and her future on the line because she believed in justice more than she believed in protecting herself." Alexander's eyes found Sophia's, and the smile that crossed his face transformed him completely. "Ms. Sophia Reynolds, investigative financial journalist, is the reason Richard Hayes is behind bars, instead of living comfortably in a country with no extradition treaty." The cameras swiveled toward Sophia, and she felt her cheeks burn as flashbulbs went off around her. This wasn't what she'd expected when Alexander had asked her to attend the press conference. "But more than that," Alexander continued, his voice growing softer but somehow carrying even more weight. "Sophia taught me something I'd forgotten how to do. She taught me how to be real, how to be vulnerable, how to trust someone completely even when that trust seemed impossible." A reporter in the back raised her hand. "Mr. Stone, are you saying that your relationship with Ms. Reynolds began as part of her investigation?" Alexander nodded. "Our relationship began as a pretense, a fake arrangement that was supposed to serve both our professional needs. But somewhere along the way, the pretending stopped, and the most genuine connection of my life began." Sophia felt tears prick at her eyes. They'd talked about going public with their relationship, but she hadn't expected Alexander to be this open about their unconventional beginning. "Mr. Stone," another reporter called out, "there were rumors that you were planning to propose to someone. Can you comment on that?" Alexander's smile became almost boyish. "Well, since you asked." He stepped away from the podium, and Sophia's breath caught in her throat as he walked directly toward her. The press conference room fell into absolute silence as Alexander knelt on one knee in front of Sophia's chair. From his jacket pocket, he produced a simple platinum ring with a single perfect diamond that caught the camera lights like captured starlight. "Sophia Reynolds," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "You've seen me at my worst and somehow decided I was worth loving anyway. You've challenged me, inspired me, and shown me that the person I was meant to be was always there, just waiting for the right person to call him home." Sophia's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at the man she'd fallen in love with against all odds, against all logic, against every rule she'd ever set for herself. "I don't want to pretend anymore," Alexander continued. "I don't want to fake anything or hide behind corporate personas or family expectations. I want to be real with you for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" The silence in the room was deafening. Every camera was trained on them, every reporter holding their breath for her answer. But for Sophia, the room had narrowed to just the two of them, Alexander kneeling before her with his heart in his eyes, offering her a future she'd never dared to imagine. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, the press conference room erupted in applause and camera flashes. But Sophia barely noticed. All she could focus on was the way Alexander looked at her as he stood up, like she was his entire world, like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "I love you," he murmured against her ear as he pulled her into his arms. "No more pretending, no more games, just us." "Just us," she agreed, and when he kissed her, she tasted the promise of forever. The wedding took place 4 months later in Emily's garden, surrounded by close friends and family. It was intimate, personal, and nothing like the grand society event everyone expected from Alexander Stone. Sophia wore her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly, and carried wildflowers that Emily had grown herself. Alexander had abandoned his usual designer suits for something simpler, more authentic, much like the man he'd become over their time together. "Do you, Alexander James Stone, take Sophia Marie Reynolds to be your wife? To have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live?" The officiant's words carried across the small gathering. "I do," Alexander said, his voice strong and sure. "And I promise to always be real with you, to trust you with my whole heart, and to never let pride stand between us again. Do you, Sophia Marie Reynolds, take Alexander James Stone to be your husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and bad, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Sophia replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "And I promise to always choose honesty, to support your dreams even when they scare me, and to love both the CEO and the history teacher in you." Alexander's eyes filled with tears at her reference to his abandoned dreams. In the months since their reconciliation, they'd talked about everything. His regrets, her fears, their hopes for the future. He'd even started volunteering at a local community college, teaching evening history classes to adults returning to education. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Alexander, you may kiss your bride." As their lips met, sealing their promise to each other, Sophia felt the last piece of her guarded heart fall into place. This man who'd started as a stranger asking for a simple favor had become her partner, her best friend, her home. The reception was everything their corporate events had never been: genuine laughter, heartfelt toasts, and dancing that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with joy. Emily's speech made everyone cry. Alexander's business partners seemed genuinely shocked by how happy and relaxed he appeared, and Sophia's editor kept shaking his head in amazement at how his star reporter had somehow landed the story and the man of her dreams. As the evening wound down, Alexander and Sophia found themselves alone in the garden where they'd just pledged their lives to each other. The fairy lights Emily had strung through the trees cast everything in a warm, golden glow. "No regrets?" Alexander asked, pulling Sophia close as they swayed to music drifting from the house. "Only one," Sophia said, and Alexander's eyebrows rose in concern. "I regret that it took us so long to stop pretending and start being real with each other." Alexander's relieved laughter was rich and warm. "Well, Mrs. Stone, We have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. The rest of our lives, Sophia repeated, loving how the words tasted. And this time, no scripts, no performances, no pretending. No pretending, Alexander agreed, spinning her under the stars. Just love, just truth, just us. And as they danced in their fairy tale garden, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Sophia knew that sometimes the best stories are the ones that start with a lie and end with the most honest truth of all. That love, real love, is worth every risk, every fear, and every leap of faith it takes to find it. Their story had begun with, "Pretend you're with me," but it would continue forever with, "I choose to be with you." And that made all the difference. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. How many opportunities for real connection are you missing because you're too busy protecting yourself from getting hurt? Alexander and Sophia's story isn't just about a fake relationship that became real. It's about the masks we all wear every single day. Think about it. How often do you show up as the professional version of yourself? How often do you choose safety over authenticity? How many times have you walked away from something that could have been extraordinary because you were afraid of being vulnerable? The truth that most people never learn is this: the very walls we build to protect ourselves from pain are the same walls that keep us from experiencing the kind of love, success, and fulfillment we actually crave. Alexander spent years being the perfect CEO until he met someone who made him want to be perfectly human. Sophia built her career on exposing lies until she realized the biggest lie she was telling was to herself about what she really wanted. But here's what makes their story so powerful. They both had to risk everything they thought they wanted to get everything they actually needed. Alexander had to risk his reputation, his family's approval, and his carefully controlled image. Sophia had to risk her career, her story, and her belief that professional success was more important than personal happiness. Now I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. What are you pretending about in your own life? What mask have you been wearing for so long that you've forgotten who you really are underneath it? What would happen if you stopped performing for everyone else and started living for yourself? Maybe you're in a relationship that looks perfect on paper but leaves you feeling empty inside. Maybe you're in a career that impresses others but slowly kills your soul. Maybe you're so afraid of being rejected for who you really are that you've never given anyone the chance to love the authentic you. The lesson here isn't just about love. It's about courage. The courage to stop pretending. The courage to be vulnerable. The courage to risk everything safe and predictable for something real and transformative. Because here's the thing. The life you're settling for right now isn't protecting you from pain. It's protecting you from joy. Alexander and Sophia could have played it safe. They could have kept their arrangement professional, avoided the complications, and walked away with their hearts intact. But they would have also walked away from the greatest love of their lives. So what are you walking away from? What opportunities are you missing because you're too afraid to take off the mask and show up as who you really are? Your story doesn't have to be about pretending anymore. Your story can be about the moment you decided to stop performing and start living. But that story only begins when you find the courage to be real, even when real feels terrifying. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the masks you're wearing and the authentic life you're not living, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're going to keep sharing stories that don't just entertain you, stories that challenge you to become the person you were always meant to be. Stories that prove love, success, and happiness aren't about being perfect. They're about being real.